We interrupt this game theory before it even begins with a special announcement. Remember that time I said these things? It also means that I get to experiment with some new projects, which I've been hinting at for a while because I'm really excited and I think you will be too. Well, after months of working on it with my friends Marcus and Karf, the super secret special project is ready to premiere. This Tuesday, in fact. A new show by yours truly is getting ready to launch. Here's a sneak preview. And after that, later this week is another game theory, which is on a game that you all requested a lot, and has turned out to be one of my all-time favorite episodes. So tune in all this week and get ready to OD on some MatPat. Now, back to your regularly scheduled game theory. Well then. Maybe? Got nothing. It's harder than it looks, okay? Hello, Internet. Welcome to Game Theory. Rambo, I ain't. And after 96 episodes of this series, you guys know me. When I'm not thinking way too hard about things like the symbolism of a magical hand creature, I'm acting like the cinema sins for video games, picking them apart for their lack of realism. Oh, you can't actually do a leap of faith to land in hay. Oh, that game says it's about Roman strategy, so let's build a Roman city and see how that works. Oh, sure, these are video game women, but do their boobs behave realistically? No. Like an overeager Mario Jumpman Mario, I bring the hammer down on these gaps in realism, not because I want games to be hyper-realistic, far from it, but because it gives me a chance to teach you guys about the real-life equivalents. And meanwhile, we all laugh at the absurdity of video game logic and Lara Croft's rock-hard rack. But when a game company brags about their product's attention to realism, well then, now you've awakened the beast. You're just asking for trouble. And that's exactly what happened with Gaijin Entertainment, the developers of the World War II tank and plane MMO, War Thunder, who not only bragged about their attention to detail, but proceeded to fly me down to Texas, take me to a tank museum, and challenge me to compare the real-life tanks with their virtual counterparts. You have got to admire those cojones. And let me be clear, just because this was their event, I ensured that I was given free rein to say whatever I wanted to. Like a good researcher, I would never agree to something like this if my results were going to be compromised. In fact, it made me want to be even more critical just to keep my integrity intact. So get ready, because the mission of the day is to put these tanks to the test against their real-life counterparts. Now let's roll out! Now in War Thunder's new Steel Generals expansion pack, they added a bunch of American tanks to the game, including the 3 I got to explore during the Texas trip: the Sherman, the Chaffee, and the Stuart. And the 3 represent a fascinating cross-section of tank technology. Let's take them out one by one. The M3 Stuart is a light tank named after the Civil War General Jeb Stuart. Sorry, J.E.B. Stuart. A man who must be single-handedly responsible for the name Jeb coming into existence, since no one recognized that they were actually his initials. It's interesting because it's an American tank that joined World War II before America did. Originally, the Stuart was being used by the British until the US showed up and started using them too. But since they were over there so early, the Stuart tank was technically the first American to engage enemies in combat. Now let's look at the tank itself. It's a pretty light tank with a small main cannon, size 37mm, which, to give you an idea, is about the diameter of your typical watch face. So big enough that you don't want it traveling towards your head, but small by cannon standards. Add to that a couple of machine guns, and you have yourself a nice little artillery vehicle. But what made the Stuart valuable was its relatively high speed and maneuverability compared to most of its heavier opponents. Very similar to Oddjob in GoldenEye. Slappers only. Ugh, I hated that well-dressed little man. Eventually, the Stuarts stopped being used for tank versus tank combat and either became reconnaissance machines, or they were sent to areas where the tank threat was much less serious, like Japan or the Philippines. And well, yes, it's easy to skin an in-game vehicle to look like a particular tank, and the sound is all dead on, since while I was researching the tanks, they were also recording the actual tank's sound effects to use in the game. I'm most interested in the tank's in-game behavior and weaknesses. So, how do you kill this tank? Well, the obvious weakness is the relatively tiny gun and light armor. So of course, the best counter to a Stuart is a bigger tank and good aim. I mean, one of the tank experts at the museum said said that the best tank strategy in general is have the bigger gun and get ready to run. But seriously, for as indestructible as these things look, almost any other tank can punch right through it, including other Stuarts. Another crucial weakness for the Stuart is terrain. Its treads are fairly narrow, so ground pressure is much higher than other tanks in its class. Think of it like a bed of nails. Narrow treads means less distribution of the tank's weight across the ground, which means that travel through mud and snow becomes much tougher as the tank sinks into the ground. And finally, the Stuart runs on what's known as a radial aircraft engine, which requires high-octane fuel and thereby increases the risk of a fire. So how's its virtual counterpart do? Well, War Thunder gets it all exactly right. Pretty much any tank cannon will either destroy your tank outright or kill the crew inside with a single well-placed shot. The engine placement is exactly where it should be, and some shrapnel headed in its direction will ignite this puppy like a firework. And on the offensive side, shooting the cannon produces little recoil in the tank itself thanks to the smaller caliber gun. In short, just like in real life, the game's equivalent is like the tin foil of the tank world, meant to be used for quick scouting and not head-to-head combat. Now, if you want a light vehicle with a little more punch, look no further than the M24 Chaffee, the second tank on my checklist. The Chaffee is named after United States Army General Adna R. Chaffee Jr., a man who played a large part in introducing tanks into the US military. It was specifically designed to be a beefier replacement for the Stuart, and it somewhat succeeded. The armor is about the same quality as the Stuart, which isn't great, but the gun? It's almost exactly double the size of the Stuart's. I feel like there's a penis joke to be inserted there. The problem was, the Chaffee came a little late. Feel like there's a penis joke in there, too. Chafees didn't reach Europe until November of 1944, but as you history buffs know, or perhaps more accurately, as you students forced to memorize the dates by your history teacher may recall, the war ended on September 2nd, 1945. That was only a few months later, and as you can imagine, the US Post Office puts huge fees on overnighting 40,000-pound war machines. So by the time these guys reached the fronts, most divisions still just used the Stuart as their standard light tank. The Chaffee saw a little more use in the Korean War, but by then, tanks in general tended to be heavier models. And just like the Stuart, it really just became used for recon. Just like the Stuart, to take this guy out, it was still pretty easy, with almost any tank caliber cannon in existence. But because this tank is so standard looking, many of its weak points were actually very easily identifiable by the enemy. Take for instance the shape of the turret, with its tapered bottom. This was meant to help the Chaffee keep a low profile, but it also perfectly highlights the horizontal turret drive responsible for its ability to rotate. One well-placed shot could totally cripple the tank. Can you imagine trying to aim a tank at something without being able to rotate the turret? That's like trying to turn around in a hallway in the original Resident Evil. Ain't gonna happen. Another weakness is the treads. Where the Stuart had sprockets that touched the ground, the Chaffees are much higher up on the body, and therefore much easier to hit at a distance. That in turn made it much easier to detread the tank. That said, it was still pretty tough to get close to this guy if you were on foot, because the treads were wider, the machine guns it packed were even scarier, and the low profile made it easier to spot enemies from farther off. Not that I'd ever recommend taking on a tank on your own in any situation at all, but with the Chaffee, smoke bombs are gonna be your best friend, and once you're able to get close, I'd recommend trying something like that neat sticky bomb trick that they used in Saving Private Ryan. Spoilers, I guess? I can already feel you typing. It has been over 15 years, my friends. Tom Hanks dies, Matt Damon lives, and Vin Diesel's insistence on living his life a quarter mile at a time.
I live my life a quarter mile at a time.
Doesn't get him too far. But back to the world of video games. In War Thunder, the Chaffee is used similarly to the Stuart, but it feels a little more tanky. It's a little slower, but the heavier gun makes it more threatening. And while the armor is about the same rating between the two, which is historically correct, the Chaffee's design makes it more likely to survive a hit or two. That said, targeting the area where the turret meets the tank body is totally an effective way to take it down. And unlike many of the other tank treads in the game, this guy's feels particularly vulnerable. So yeah, once again, very historically accurate. It takes real skill to use this guy. So overall, Gaijin no Goomba Entertainment had reason to be confident in the fidelity of their game. Its fidelity is high. One might say high fidelity. High fidelity. No one? Year 2000 comedy with John Cusack and Jack Black? Okay, that's fine. I'll take my film jokes elsewhere. The last tank I researched was the M4 Sherman, who you may remember from such wars as the Second World War and the movie Fury. Believe me, this dude is the one you think of when you imagine the stereotypical tank. The Sherman is a beast compared to the other two guys. Named after General William Tecumseh Sherman, when this tank first burst onto the scene, it outclassed almost every German tank it came across. true, it was only a few years later when the German Panthers and Tigers began outperforming it, but by then the Sherman was so easy to produce, just being good enough was fine. America's tank strategy became quantity over quality. When speaking about firepower, the Sherman had the same caliber gun as the Chaffee, but with much heavier armor. You guys can rest easy, Foot Clan, because this guy wasn't meant for ground troops. Inspired by the success of the German Blitzkrieg's whirlwind speed and brutality, the Sherman was much more focused on tank-to-tank combat, and because it had a gyroscopic stabilizer built into the turret, it could actually fire somewhat accurately while in motion, something practically unheard of in a lot of these other tank models. So you want to kill this guy? Other than just being a bigger tank with a bigger gun like a German Tiger or Panther, anything that could conceivably catch the tank on fire was going to be your best bet. From a Molotov cocktail to a phosphorus round, Shermans were extremely prone to catching fire, to the point that British soldiers began referring to it as the Ronson, in reference to a brand of lighter at the time, whose slogan was, "Lights first every time." That's brutal! Leave it to the British to keep burning to death in a flaming metal tub. Super classy. Other strategic disadvantages? It's fairly tall, and much of the heavy armor plating depends on where the tank is hit and at what angle. In short, if you're playing War Thunder, the Sherman is your basic entry-level medium tank. It's like choosing Mario and Smash Bros. It's heavy enough for a beginner to take a few hits, and powerful enough that a skilled player could take down a slightly more powerful tank with some measure of confidence. And that is really it. You know, my original plan for this video was to point out all the glaring inconsistencies between the tanks in the game and the tanks in real life, but the dev team is so darn dedicated and accurate that I just can't do that. So much of this game is just too accurate, to the point that the game data and the real-world data were almost indistinguishable. It really soured my grapes. But oh, loyal theorists, I haven't forsaken thee, because even with all their attention to detail, Gaijin Entertainment did miss one very significant detail when it comes to driving tanks around the battlefield. In fact, they failed to include a tank's biggest weakness of all. The tank's own worst enemy is itself: malfunctions. Malfunctioning tanks were a major problem, especially for the Sherman, with as many as 30 to 50% breaking down on their way to the field, or even worse, while on the front. That's the last thing you need in a heavy artillery battle. And if you stop to think about what I told you earlier about the Shermans, you can start to see why this failure rate was so high. The US strategy was mass producing these things. Of course it's gonna be sloppier and corners are gonna get cut. For all the brilliance of German engineering, it took Germany so long to fix their beautifully designed masterpiece tanks that the US would just build more Shermans and overwhelm them with sheer numbers. And Gaijin Entertainment, in their quest to create a truly realistic tank game experience, failed to include that critical design flaw. Ha ha! I gotcha! Actually, I didn't. The problem with tanks breaking down was so prevalent, and the dev team's commitment to realism was so high, that they seriously considered adding a randomized failure mechanic into the game. Imagine spawning onto the battlefield only to have your tank sit there like a rock, for no apparent reason, just because it was a lemon coming off the shelves. Obviously, you can see why their attention to detail stopped at that point. It's fascinating. Even the most realistic video game with a dev team who is super committed to realistic fidelity has their limits. In order for a video game to truly stay fun, it seems like there are limits to how much realism you can work in. But hey, that's just a theory. A game theory. Thanks for watching. Welcome back to the Super Amazing End Card Tournament, where I have a few to catch you up on. For our PewDiePie video, an overwhelming number of you get most of your entertainment from either YouTube or online sources. 600% more, in fact, than the TV viewers. So suck on that, cable. And in Lego Batman, surprisingly, most of you voted for Black Hand, the deranged and murderous Black Lantern. That's, cool, I guess? Kinda more disturbing, actually. This week, we're taking a page out of War Thunder's book. Would you prefer your games super realistic or with a bit more fantasy thrown in? Like, would you prefer the slow, difficult to aim tanks in War Thunder or the totally OP fantasy tanks of pretty much every other game in existence? Click on one to choose and cast your vote. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to go practice my machine gunning skills. That experience at the top of the video? Yeah, felt like I was getting my man card revoked. I was barely holding on to it to begin with.